When you're talking to somebody and you find out that they're a fan of David Markson, what does that tell you about them as a reader?
Oh, good question. Well, that they're open to new things. I mean, not the usual sort of family novel, or that they're adventurous readers. Not adventurous. I mean, he's a fairly easy read, but that they like new things, things that stand out a bit.
From KCSB in Santa Barbara and Colin Marshall Radio, I'm Colin Marshall, and this is the Marketplace of Ideas. We're talking about David Markson for good reason, because I am talking with Françoise Palleau-Papin, the author of the first book-length study of the works of the American novelist David Markson, the late American novelist David Markson, who died in 2010. It's called This Is Not a Tragedy. Now, how did you get into David Markson? What was your first experience with the work of David Markson?
Oh, that's I'm very grateful, actually, because friends of mine just told me you have to read him. And at that point, I remember I was super busy, and I just didn't, I was too busy, but the advice stuck, and this friend kept sort of, goading me, come on, you've got to read him, he's really, really different. And so I did, and then I just got hooked. I couldn't let go, and one thing led to another. I met him, and he was charming. He was very, very kind to me, and I started working on him. So basically, the friend who really wanted me to read him is like me, part of a reading group that we have here, and we just try to read what's a little out of the beaten, path. And so she really thought, he was on her reading list, and then she shared with us and insisted, and I'm still thankful. I quote her in my book. That's how, I'm really thankful. So that's it. You've got a number of fans here.
What was that first book you read of his?
The very first one was, which one was that again? Reader's Block. And then I just read everything, Reader's Block is the one my friend commented on, and she did a marvelous job of it, she thought. And then she also wrote an article on, she started the whole thing for me, really. She wrote an article on Springer's Progress. And then I just tried to get, I bought everything I could lay hands on. And in those years, a lot of his books were out of print. I mean, that's not long ago, but now they've been republished, mainly, Shoemaker and Horde and Dalkey Archives, so now it's easier. But in those days, I remember going through secondhand bookstores, and I just wanted to read everything he had written. And I still find him really, he's got something that I couldn't find anywhere else. So, that's it.
That book you started out with, Reader's Block, the first one you read of his, that's a fascinating David Markson book to have read first, because of it being his early change to the style he's well known for now, which I'll start describing and say that for those listeners who have never read David Markson, it's a book, Reader's Block, built out of very small paragraphs, a sentence or two, built out of facts from the lives of artists, and it's in no way conventional. But what did you think when you first started reading the book that was built this way, that was built out of all these fragments about other artists and with a plot that you had to step back to actually perceive?
Sure. Well, that's it. The plot got me, actually. I mean, it's in many ways like a very old-fashioned traditional novel. I was completely hooked because I wanted to see where he was going, and there's actually how he would lead me there. In other words, I was gripped by a very old-fashioned desire to know what would happen to that character he calls protagonist, because he's obviously in dire straits, living in a cemetery and whatnot, and then you just want to know what exactly. There is a storyline, and I guess my reading was actually, in spite of all the fragmentation, my reading was extremely conservative, extremely traditional, and I just wanted to know what happened next, because he doesn't lose you in all the fragments. He gives you a storyline, or several maybe storylines, and then I just wanted to know how he would unravel it, and it was gripping in an old-fashioned way, like a friend of mine, another friend of mine, said that it read like an airport thriller, and to me that is the truest comment, really. So in many ways, I was a very naive reader. I just wanted to know, he's in bad shape. What is going to happen to that poor man, who sounds like a Beckett character, living nowhere and with no life. So I guess that he has that appeal as well.
We have a radio host over here whom you may or may not be familiar with, named Michael Silverblatt, and he's been on this show. He's been on my show, but he interviewed David Markson a few years ago in 2007, and Michael Silverblatt said to David Markson that his books were addictive because these fragments were like potato chips. He would eat one and couldn't stop eating the next and the next and the next. Did you find that the addictiveness went beyond the plot and also extended to the form? Was the form addictive to you?
Oh, of course. Definitely. It is addictive in the sense that you, and Markson said that himself, it's almost addictive in the sense that you, now that when I read Dickens, let's say, when I read Dickens, I end up reading Dickens the way I read David Markson. I mean, it may sound crazy, but I was just rereading Bleak House, and I end up looking for the connections between the details that seem randomly given, and everything connects pretty much the way things connect in David Markson's novels. And so, I guess I don't know if I've been completely, I'm addicted, yes, but in the sense that David Markson just took things that were there one step further. And he plays a connective game that Dickens started to play much earlier. And he takes it one whole step further in the sense that I feel as a reader that I'm much more active. I have to connect more. I have to follow several strands at once, And it's not just me. I think I was talking to my students the other week, because I assigned that book, Reader's Block, to a class. And they came up with different reading stories. That is, each of them had chosen to sort of pay more attention to certain details and had a different plot line than mine, or, had followed a particular, strand of clues. And they had gathered those pieces together and built up their own story. So that's what it's addictive, is that we're so active as readers to gather the fragments. And I guess it's a fantasy. We fantasize about the fragments we read because they appeal to us.
Tell me what you think of this, and it's something I just thought of while you were making the comparison to Dickens, but whether we're talking about a very traditional type of novel, like a novel by Charles Dickens, which everybody would call traditional, even just on the face of it, or we're talking about books like The Last Four that David Markson wrote, the style we're talking about now, which some people would look at and say, oh, that's wildly experimental. They both have they're both built out of many small things, whether it's in Dickens, the events all moving the plot forward, or in David Markson, these pieces of trivia all moving the plot forward. But in either one, all of these little things are all so painstakingly constructed toward a single goal. Is that something that these books have in common? Does that make sense, what I've said?
Oh, of course. I mean, this is it. It does. It's very well, very, very, very well crafted and constructed, but at the same time, it leaves a lot of room for. I think I've never felt freer as a reader because doesn't take you by the hand. Neither does Dickens, by the way. There's just so much freedom. You are free to connect the pieces. Some pieces are not, or to focus on one particular type of storyline rather than another, depending on what your personal preferences are, I guess. And what I found very moving was that some of the, I'll use a big word, like meta-textual comments, like how does a novel get written, how is it constructed, built, or whatever, crafted. Well, those meta-textual comments end up to be as almost heartbreaking and touching and moving in the sense of feelings as, as a touching event in Dickens's well-crafted plot, because there's this appeal that, I saw that. That was the clue that was given. Hey, I was careful. And in many ways, you're very proud as a reader to put two and two together, or in Markson's case, 10 and 10 together. I don't know if I'm being clear, but it's really a thrill to just connect all those things and pay attention to form in a way that's as emotionally satisfying as paying attention to plot, boy meets girl, that sort of thing.
And one of the themes that emerges most clearly from all of the fragments in these books, and Reader's Block is the first of David Markson's last 4 novels, I believe, including Vanishing Point, This Is Not a Novel, and the last novel. But the theme that I find most prominent in all these is the theme of death. It's very concerned, these 4 books, with death. And I've always thought of This Is Not a Novel as being the most death-heavy of them, but I do consider that to be a running theme throughout all of them. I mean, do you find that to be the predominant theme in these as well, or is that simply my interpretation of these?
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. There is a certain, definitely, there is morbidity in all of them. However, and this is, again, going back to the shape or the form or the construction of the novel, the morbidity is in the theme. I mean, it keeps harping on end of life. Everybody ends of life and sadness. But while this is a predominant theme, the freedom of the reading contract, if I can call it that way, or the freedom of the association and the sheer movement of the combinations is, to me, lifelike. So there's this constant pull in either direction. Thematically, it's completely morbid in many, although what goes against that maybe, or maybe not, is there's a lot of humor. But on the other hand, the structure itself, as we read, as we jump from one paragraph to another, connected to what we remember of a paragraph that was 10 pages earlier, or maybe 1 page earlier, that itself is so lifelike in the sense that, we're bombarded with information, with tidbits that we can just begin to make sense of as we go along and as we remember and put the pieces together. So that, to me, is very active, lifelike, and anything but morbid. However, the general theme is about an old man dying or coming close to the end of his life and, assessing things, deciding, sorting things out. And in a way, that's part of life, too. I mean, that morbidity. So I don't have a problem with that, although some of my students have sometimes. I think, it's just so sad sometimes. It's, and the reason why they react that way, if I can, I've asked them, why, if you don't like it, why? Well, why do you think it's so sad? And they said, because it works. In many ways, they realized that it was good because it made them sad and they were affected by that morbidity, which I think is a good sign that it worked, that as a novel. It's not gimmicky. it's actually touching. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my feeling about that.
The sadness is one element that affects the reader from this whole theme of death, but I can't help but compare David Markson to certain other novelists who are very concerned with the situation of the aging artist, especially the aging male artist, the aging male novelist facing their own imminent death. And John Updike wrote about this, and he took criticism for focusing on that. Philip Roth writes about this, though he's still alive, and he takes criticism for that. But David Markson, he writes about this, and nobody seems to criticize him for his focus on the situation of the male author who is aging and who is coming near death. Nobody ever seems to complain that he focused on that to the exclusion of other people, whereas for John Updike and Philip Roth, that was the main complaint, that they thought only of themselves. Have you ever thought about that kind of contrast?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a great comment, because that is so true. And I think the reason why David Markson doesn't get that kind of criticism is that he doesn't just consider himself aging as, poor me, I'm going to die, although I have sympathies with that because that's our case for all of it, and that's the case for all of us. But the reason why he doesn't get that is that his books are not narcissistic in any way. They're more an assessment of not just the end of the life of one character, but the end, maybe, or assessing, I don't know if it's the end of a civilization, but they're really assessing the end of an age. They're trying to come to terms with something that's much larger than one person or one characterization, or it's more assessing, the failures of a civilization or of an era. Why, in his case, he revolves around the question, how could we get to such massacres as the Shoah or others? He mentions many. How does a civilization cope with its dark side? So it's not just the dark side of one character feeling depressed and lonely and, whatnot at the end of his life. It's more, should we look at our age and feel depressed because we have failed in so many things? And in that way, I would compare him not so much to Updike, and you're right, and to Roth or some of those writers, but I would compare this, even though it's extremely different, to what Cormac McCarthy has done recently. Now, Cormac McCarthy is aging. I'm not sure, I think he's much younger than David, but he's written novels, and to put it bluntly, I thought I knew Cormac McCarthy, and that he wasn't doing anything new. Well, and he has. And his last publications are in many ways an assessment of an era's failures, or what do we do if we come to the end of the world as we know it? If it we come near destruction, how do we survive? What matters most then? If you can barely find water or food, I'm talking about No Country for Old Men. Well, what matters then is charity, old-fashioned things like goodness of heart, things like that. And I think this is one reason why the end of a life is not so morbid. I still don't find his novels, morbidity is certainly there, but it's not just the only thing there. And like Cormac McCarthy, he considers, he pushes humanity very far to our last resort. And then he says, and then what? And then who are you really once you have nothing left? Like once you're really close to death, what matters to you then says everything about you. And so that's why he's not narcissistic to my reading. And he's very giving. That's comforting.
And one element that's hard to ignore of the way that Markson writes about death in the last 4 novels he wrote was that he often writes about death through writing about the deaths of various artists throughout history, where they died, when they died, how they died, under what circumstances they sort of lived up to their death. And there's a certain feeling there, at least I feel it, that he uses these facts to make a case that the world tends to fail our artists. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, this it's both a reflection on that, which is so true, and also there is a biographical element. David wasn't exactly wealthy.
Right.
That's putting it mildly. That's a euphemism, if any. His wife was very active. His ex-wife, who was still his agent after they separated. She was very good and very active in helping out, and he got endowments and things like that. But he still makes a general reflection on not just himself, but he considers all the artists before him who were desperate in life. I mean, in everyday life, because either they didn't have money or recognition or understanding of any sort. And he makes a point, I mean, in a cumulative way, he harps on this all the time. So there's both, to me, a very moving element, autobiographical element there, and also reflection on a philosophic reflection on the way we consider artists. I mean, it hasn't been the case in all civilizations. There's a specific advantage given to money-making, and many artists, true artists, if I may call them that way, don't make much money if they're trailblazers. That is a reflection that he wanted to sort of put into our face. And then he considers many different countries. I mean, there's Van Gogh in France, or his native country, Holland, and there's he considers this very widely, and it just builds out this cumulative argument that we don't consider those people highly because they're a problem. They show us things that we may want to block out or whatever. But he doesn't say this in a terribly boring way, the way I am doing now, thank God. He says it in a much more intricate manner, piece by piece. He drives you to this conclusion, very heavily sometimes, and also very subtly, when he makes connections between artists and other figures of impoverishment or diminished figures, or people who don't unfashionable figures that can't be role models because they're blocked out from the view. And so he drives us through this in a very nice way, which I consider both obsessional in the way that he harps on it, and lighthearted, because sometimes he brings in a lot of humor. Sometimes it's very grim, like when he mentions the death of Modigliani, the artist who died in terrible circumstances, but sometimes there's humor too, or even though it's grim humor, and he just leads you to that reflection, and then you think, hey, what do I do for artists today? I mean, do I really read them? What, or do I just buy regular commercial fiction? Where do I stand? I mean, am I blind too? I think we are, to a certain extent. How do we cope? In what ways are we different? We like to think of ourselves romantically as helping out the artist, but really, what prevents us from even getting to know them? And that's a general consideration that's more economic and very broad. But, and thank God your program is there, by the way.
Indeed. Now, I want to get an idea, because you've read David Markson's work so closely, because you've written about it extensively, because you have communicated directly with David Markson. Of course, the book includes some of the things David Markson has said and written to you. What sense do you have about whether David Markson felt he needed or had some duty to be the type of figure who was little known and who was impoverished and who was marginalized in some sense? I mean, did he seem to feel that if he had been better known, or if he had been wealthier by his writing, that would mean he had not achieved some sort of goal of his?
Probably. He might have felt, I don't know if I can speak for him. I mean, I'm imagining that he might have felt like selling out, really. His heroes were people like William Gaddis. And Gaddis is now, of course, a major figure. But success came very, very late. You're right. In many ways, he put himself into this little pigeonhole, but not just because of masochism or masochist for masochistic reasons. There's this sense that he didn't want to do just your average, he wanted to do something different. And for that, I don't think you can just copy exactly what has been done before. And so in many ways, he gave up on success very early. I'd say as early as after The Ballad of Dingus McGee, which was made into a film that he didn't like for good reason. And I don't know if you've seen it. It's
No.
so bad. Oh my God, it's awful. So he realized things were not going to work. I mean, he couldn't do not just film adaptations because, for good reasons, he plays with words, and that doesn't easily translate into visual art or like a movie. But also, he wanted to do something else, and so in many ways, he didn't write many books. I mean, if you consider that he's written all his life. There's not that much out there. Pretty much like William Gaddis didn't write many books, even though they were bulkier. It was his choice, which is a profound philosophical choice.
If you've just tuned in, this is The Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Françoise Palleau-Papin, the author of This Is Not a Tragedy, the first book-length study of the works of novelist David Markson. If when this conversation is over you want to listen again, visit colinmarshallradio.com for the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, or go to iTunes. On the iTunes store, just search for The Marketplace of Ideas, and there you'll find all the interviews completely free for the download, for the putting on your iPod, or whatever you want to do with them. If you want to be kept updated on all things Marketplace of Ideas, information about current and upcoming interviews, plus related internet interestingness, sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. You can do that by going to colinmarshallradio.com, following the instructions on the Marketplace of Ideas front page. Any questions, comments, feedback, guest suggestions, whatever you want to send me, don't hesitate. Do it. Send it to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. That's Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. Now, right back to the conversation with Françoise Palleau-Papin, the author of This Is Not a Tragedy, the works of David Markson, on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. To extend the William Gaddis comparison, because I think this one will reveal something, William Gaddis wrote books that, as you said, are big, but his early novel, The Recognitions, which is also his best known, it seems to me that book is quite readable, even though it takes a long time to read. The challenge there is the page count. But then Gaddis went on to write books like J.R., and J.R., it's a book that when you read it, it doesn't seem like it wants you to read it. It almost dares you to keep reading it. Whereas the novels of David Markson, they want you to keep reading. The word we used before was addictive. They want you to keep going. Never has David Markson written what I would call an inaccessible book, or a book that puts off the reader, or that not challenges, because I think David Markson's books challenge the reader in a good way, but he has not written any books that defy the reader to read them, like, for example, J.R. or some of Gaddis's other later novels. I mean, what's the difference there?
Well, he doesn't, clearly, you're right, he's eminently readable. I mean, that's by anyone, including non-professional readers, of course. He's an easy read. However, he really didn't want to lose readers. Although just to round up on Gaddis, I don't think he wanted to lose readers in the nasty sense. He just wanted us to accept getting lost in fiction, which is a completely different case. But Markson didn't want to lose readers, and he didn't want to lose the traditional readers either. Although I'm not sure how many, first of all, I'm not sure who a traditional reader is really, but his books may lose readers if they browse through them. That's one thing. I really always say that you have to read Markson in a very, very traditional manner from A to Z. In other words, don't skip. That might do for a second reading, but not the first. So in other words, he wanted us to read in a very linear, traditional manner. The sequence of the reading matters because he crafted those novels so well. The periodic returns to the same themes build up a little like a spiral, really, a figure. That builds up. So he didn't want to lose us because he's not trying. He doesn't try our patience as readers. And he's intensely rewarding that way. But he does lose you if you lose track, if you begin to browse, if you think that's such a quick, we'll just flip this through the pages, then you lose track of all the threads. I mean, I may be a professional reader, I don't know, but I read Gaddis the same way. I personally love J.R. I mean, that's an old favorite of mine. But J.R. is all about losing the reader and trying to get the reader to accept to get lost because you find yourself again. In J.R., you get a second wind. In David Markson's fiction, you don't need a second wind. You're always buoyed over. I mean, I don't know if I'm clear at all, but you're always, he's with you at all times. You never get lost. He was very, very finicky, very, very painstakingly precise. And so and he was not an elitist in any way. He just wants everybody to be able to follow this. And the tidbits he gives you sound like gossip at times. They have that appeal too. Almost, in the nasty sense of the word, the gossip. Oh, I didn't know that writer did this. Oh my God, how bad. That sort of. So he's, to me, he's popular in that way. He can appeal to, the gossipy side of me. I mean, I read him like a magazine sometimes, I don't know if I'm answering your question or getting off track there.
No, it makes complete sense. But I should now add that we've been speaking about David Markson's final 4 novels, which all have this same form, this fragmented form, this form built out of facts. But, of course, in your book, this is not a tragedy. You devote even more space to the novels that precede those final 4. Of course, we've mentioned The Ballad of Dingus McGee early on, plus there were the crime novels, which he calls entertainments before those, and after them, Springer's Progress in the 70s and Wittgenstein's Mistress in the 80s, perhaps his best-known book. But since you started off with Reader's Block, I want to get an idea, what was it like for you then to go back to the early novels and to find this relatively conventional but still not conventional David Markson in those books, and the one I forgot to mention as well, Going Down. I mean, what was it like to come upon the earlier material from him that is so different?
Well, yeah. So first of all, it was like, because I read it backwards, I tended to, I paid more attention to the disjunctions in the stories and the so-called very traditional plot lines. I could see where he came from. In other words, I paid more attention to the disruptions and the changes of voices. And you mentioned going down. That's amazing. I mean, he changes viewpoints almost like in every chapter, or sometimes more so. And that, what was thrilling and a lot of fun for me was to read my favorite detective novel that hasn't been reprinted yet, which is a very short piece that also changes viewpoint at every chapter, but in a hilarious manner. I mean, I'm talking about the Miss Doll Go Home.
Yes.
Which I'd love to see reprinted because my copy is battered and awful. It's those pulp paperbacks from the 60s that are so yellow and brittle and just coming apart. But that is a hilarious novel that tells you everything about David Markson, that the fragmentation, the changes of viewpoints are hilarious, and the fun he has with the canons of literature. I don't know if you remember that novel, but he has a mad character, a mad woman who's hilarious. Thinks she's Lady Chatterley. And
yes.
So she runs around this garden naked with flowers. I mean, she tapes flowers on her naked body and just tries, she runs around a poor man who's trying to escape because he's afraid of her. And so all those things, he's basically having a game, having a ball with the canons of literature. So, D.H. Lawrence and a lot of others. Steinbeck is in there. And he plays around with fragmentation already, even though it's just an eminently classic, not classic, but story of, robbers get robbed, that sort of comical situation that is a classic. So in many ways, I read him backwards, but I enjoyed them for what they were. They're very good. I mean, he masters his craft, and he's very funny. So they're very different in tone from the later novels, which, as you noticed, have a lot of morbidity in them. But they're everything's there. The versatility, the constant changes between one character and another, and the goofing around with literature in general.
There is a lot of that, yes, in the early novels, and there's a certain lightness and there's a certain humor in these books. Even the later 4 books that are so concerned with death, there's a humor in them, and there's a certain fun in the composition of them. And I think that's nowhere more the case than in Springer's Progress in 1977, which is a book I want to discuss in a moment. But it came after Going Down, which we mentioned, in 1970. And for all the lightness and humor of Markson's other books, Going Down, to me, it strikes me as the main exception in David Markson's body of work, because I read that book and I have a sense of sort of jagged harshness, kind of a scariness even to the setting of the book and to the feel of the book. Like maybe sinister is the word. Do you know what I mean when I say that about Going Down?
It's very grim. It's awful. It's all about it's awful, and there's a certain beauty in the sense that he develops. For example, Fern's character is a terrible character. She's maimed, and she's maimed mentally more than physically, even though she's physically maimed too. But there's a certain beauty in he delves into that character so much, and I think he doesn't do that much, except maybe in Wittgenstein's Mistress, to get into a psyche like this, to get into somebody's disturbed mental states. I mean, she ends up mentally ill by the end of the novel. And there's this development that he didn't quite pursue much. I mean, except, again, for the character of Kate in Wittgenstein's Mistress, which was probably my favorite. But it's an awfully grim novel. He had to come to terms, I think, with Mexico and the whole idea of death and crime. I mean, his Mexico is very grim in most of the chapters, or sometimes hilariously funny in one chapter, or the particular chapter about the horse.
Oh, yes.
Right. So I don't know if he's found himself yet. I mean, he's still playing around. That's an odd book in many ways, between very, very grim, awful tragedy and comical interludes for comic relief, I suppose. But he's really, what I see in that novel is this capacity to penetrate the psyche of a disturbed woman, which he develops differently, more discreet, more piece by piece in Wittgenstein's Mistress.
And certainly, I want to get to Wittgenstein's Mistress, if I can pronounce that book correctly now. But in between going down in Wittgenstein's Mistress, we have a book called, as I mentioned, Springer's Progress in 1977, which is a book a lot of Markson fans very much enjoy, and I very much enjoy as well. But he gets into another psyche in Springer's Progress. It's not a disturbed psyche, but it's one with maybe more linguistic playfulness than I've ever seen in any other book. I mean, how would you describe what he accomplishes in Springer's Progress?
Well, to me, that's a masterpiece of self-derision. I mean, it's really about a writer laughing at his... he's ridiculous in many ways. He tries to write, and the only things he can come up with to overcome his writer's block are ridiculous little games, or the way he presents them is ridiculous, which are actually Oulipo games, this
right.
Automatic production of literature when you have a writer's block, or that's his narrow definition of it. But what I really love, because he's actually playing with the canons of literature going back to Latin and Greek literature, and he's playing, or late Latin. I was amazed when I really looked at that book at how much I found. I mean, to me, that was a wonderful, very playful read. And then when I looked into it, I discovered he was using, technical prowess, or feats of, it's all about showing off as a writer, but showing off with derision. He's laughing at himself because he's supposed to be the writer, but he can't produce. And whereas his lover, who's a popular writer who writes and publishes, the way he would love to, is probably a hack writer, but she's very happy. And he's very unhappy, and also laughing at his being unhappy. And so it's full of puns and delightful, goofy, ridiculous jokes that actually make me laugh out loud. I mean, it's probably the funniest book he's ever written. But it's also very technical. It's incredibly technical without any heaviness. It's technical with fun and for the sheer love of language and literature. And that's what I love about it. I mean, it's very winning. It's a game you can join as a reader.
I'm glad you've mentioned Oulipo because, of course, that is a presence. You make that a presence in your book on Markson. But at the same time, with actual Oulipo novels, there's readers who like them. There's readers who strongly dislike them. You're never sure if, when you hand somebody an Oulipo novel, if they're going to even want to read it, because they might be put off by the very techniques used to compose the book, or that the techniques were used to compose the book. But with David Markson, you don't need to know. You don't need to know what he was doing in any sense to get enjoyment from the book. With some of the Oulipo novels, it seems like you're much better off if you know what rules the writers are playing by. Then you're able to appreciate it. But with Markson, it seems like you can simply read it, and you may gain a greater appreciation for what he did if you knew the rules he was playing by. But by no means must you know them. I mean, is that accurate?
Well, yeah, but I would, of course, for Markson, it's completely accurate. But I'd say that's accurate too of other Oulipo writers. I mean, I read Harry Matthews, who this archetypical Oulipo writer who happens to be American, and there are very few, I'll say foreign, being French, there are very few foreign Oulipo writers, and he's one of them. Well, I just read Cigarettes, completely naively. That is, I didn't want to be bothered about any rules or constraints or whatever he had decided to use there. I read it, like anything, completely naively, and I enjoyed it tremendously. So I think that's true of a lot of. Maybe I haven't read the ones you're thinking of, but that's true of a lot of. If an Oulipo writer is good, he'll be good whether you read him knowingly or not, and immensely enjoyable. So Markson, to me, is just one of them in that sense. I read Cigarettes by Matthew again, completely unaware, and then, of course, people told me and blah, blah, and sometimes you can guess a little, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I just read him like your regular novel, and I had fun. I mean, so by my standards, then when maybe we're talking about heavy-handed, maybe bad Oulipo writers, let's make a judgment, or just the good ones for which you can just forget about any rules and just enjoy them. And then if you look into it, it's rewarding at another level, like a technical level, and that's great too. So to me, he's just part of a category, or whether you know or not, like you can enjoy him at every level of reading, and that doesn't mean different people. I mean, everybody has different levels of reading. If I reread him and I see things I hadn't mentioned in my book, I haven't mentioned, and oh my God, how come I didn't see this? That's a new reading. Pass the buck. I hope there will be more readers. And he's not heavy-handed, but a lot of, I don't know, I love Italo Calvino, so the Italian Oulipo writer. And even though he makes his rules pretty clear, he never bores me. So I guess we're talking good or bad, not Oulipo or not,
Right, and I agree with you about Harry Matthews. I'm actually reading every Harry Matthews novel at the moment, and I do of course enjoy them all. I have no complaint about anything he does. But this raises a point, because we have Harry Matthews, an American Oulipo writer, and David Markson, an American writer who is not Oulipo, but who in some books may as well have been. And I want to know, because of course you teach American literature at the New Sorbonne University, and you have written about many American authors. I want to get a sense from you about what is the American-Ness of David Markson. I mean, I'm American, so I don't perceive American-Ness when I read something. But if you grew up elsewhere, I mean, in what sense is David Markson's work American to you, besides the fact that David Markson was American?
That's a very interesting, tricky question.
Yes.
I'd say, and I'm not saying this out of the top of my head. I mean, I was stealing it from someone. Good critics, something American, have said that, if anything, the American-ness of any literary output, poetry, theater, drama, fiction, is in the form, and that's interesting. So it wouldn't be in the topics as much as in the form it takes, and that's the comment that I've always wanted to look into. Stephen Cushman has written about fictions of form in American poetry, and pretty much. And a great theater critic has written, what's his name, Mark Robinson, has written pretty much the same idea that, and the idea would come from the Puritan origins, that is, if America was such a new country at the time it was built, it was made. Now, that's true of any country, I guess, but not more so of a country that's built from a colony. It was new, and it needed to make itself into a country. It needed to find its own language, its own forms, whatever the expression, in whatever art. There is, for example, definitely an American painting that draws attention to form. Mark Rothko may have had foreign origins, but to me he's such an American painter. He found a form. And there's something about, if you define yourself anew, you have to find your own shape, your own form, your own format. Otherwise, who are you but imitators of old England or whatever, and it doesn't work. So if there's an American-Ness in Markson, to me, it's his treatment of form, his understanding that form is meaning, and fragmentation for him, which he developed from previous writers. And this idea that form is meaning is also developed by some of your best critics. Like I'm thinking of Marjorie Perloff, who writes about modernism and 21st century modernism. There's something essentially American about finding a new form in poetry and drama, and here in the novel. And Markson had read Tristram Shandy, who already, not being American, but had changed the novel shape completely. Markson did something else, and that to me is American. I don't know if I'm too sort of general, but that is an essential creativity that I find American. There's an incredible flexibility about form, and the capacity to invent new forms and define yourself every time at every step. That is probably exhausting, but I find that exhilarating for a reader.
And when we're talking about creativity of form in Markson's work, obviously that's why we began with the last four novels, as the form is the most striking, in a sense, in an obvious way in those. But this brings us finally to the novel you've named as a favorite of Markson's, as your favorite of Markson's, rather, Wittgenstein's Mistress in 1988, the one I just can't say correctly anytime I say it, which is the, I will say, transition point between the somewhat more conventional novels that preceded it, though I wouldn't call something like Springer's Progress conventional, and the final four novels made of fragments using this single form. Wittgenstein's Mistress is between them, both in terms of when it was published and in terms of what form it takes. It's a novel. It is built around a fictional premise, but at the same time, it almost has the form of these last four novels, with the fragments, with the facts. And what to your mind does Markson accomplish in this book of Wittgenstein's Mistress that he does not accomplish in any of the others?
He holds both ends of the spectrum in that book, in the sense that he holds the so-called traditional characterization. It's one great long monologue, and it's one character there. And so he holds that in-depth of characterization that you would associate, that is, to me, one end of the spectrum. And then he also holds the other end, which is the more meta, that is the reflection on the whole of Western civilization, which sounds very, very vague and very well. So that would be the other end of the spectrum. But he makes it very specific through that one character, and in many ways, that's when I see him as the heir to Malcolm Lowry, who did that to a certain extent with Under the Volcano, with his character developed, and going to his death, to his end. In the meantime, bringing all of Western civilization to be judged with him, along with him, with his addictions, his alcoholism, etc. So this character, she's this very, very touching character. She's mad as a hatter, but you believe in her saneness, because you never, by moment, you almost think she's you. She's fine. She's just a little depressed. This could be anybody. And then at the same time, she's rehearsing and sort of reshuffling all those bits of Western civilizations that nobody can swallow. And so he holds both ends in a way that I find extremely successful. And that is indeed my favorite novel of his. because of that. Because of the fragmentation is there, the connections, the reader's freedom to connect or to jump ahead or backward is there. But at the same time, it's a lot more, there's the exploration of the psyche of a mad woman and her ramblings. So you both get attached to her as to a mad friend you'd like to help and can't. But also because she sends you back echoes of everything, the story of the history of your grandparents or everything, or the history you've learned at school, which becomes almost your history. I don't, how much do we know about, he's made ancient history like Troy and all that war. He's bringing it home to us because of the constant jumping back and forth and the anachronistic, jumbling that he does. That is also funny at times. But so he's bringing all that home in a way that I find so successful. And to me, that's really that's a masterpiece.
I've been speaking with Françoise Palleau-Papin, the author of This Is Not a Tragedy, the Works of David Markson. Françoise, thanks so much for taking the time to join me on the program today.
Well, thank you, really.
This has been The Marketplace of Ideas, and I've been Colin Marshall. If you want to hear this show again, visit colinmarshallradio.com or go to iTunes. In the iTunes Store, search for The Marketplace of Ideas. At both colinmarshallradio.com and iTunes, you'll find the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, of course, completely free. Questions, comments, guest suggestions, whatever, send that to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. And if you want to be kept up with all things Marketplace of Ideas, please do subscribe to the mailing list, weekly updates on current and upcoming interviews and other related fun internet stuff. You can find the instructions, they're very easy, very simple, on the Marketplace of Ideas front page at colinmarshallradio.com as well. The website of the man who makes our theme music, Ben Althouse, is available at benalthouse.com. And thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time on the Marketplace of Ideas for more cultural conversation of the depth you demand.